At the beginning of the war, for many German officers, the British seemed like a known enemy, cautious, too methodical, slow, an adversary that could be pushed, bypassed, pressured. But at some point, and it wasn't overnight, this perception began to falter. Reports changed tone, diaries became more tense, short sentences began to appear more frequently. They don't move forward when we expect them to. They don't attack when they should. They are waiting for something. And that was frightening, because it wasn't noise, it wasn't bravado, it wasn't the kind of direct aggression you learn to predict after a few battles. It was silence, it was preparation. It was an enemy that didn't rush, didn't despair, and most importantly, didn't make the same mistake twice. For an army accustomed to winning with speed and surprise, this was a serious problem. The most curious thing is that during that same period, many American commanders were still viewed differently, more impetuous, more direct, easier to provoke, not worse, just more predictable. And in war, predictability is costly. The question that began circulating within the German high command was not whether the British fought well. It was another, far more uncomfortable one. Why were some British commanders becoming so difficult to defeat? What did they do differently? What had they learned, and from whom had they learned it? This is where the story takes a turn, because German fear didn't stem from a grand speech, nor from an isolated battle. It arose from repetition, from the pattern, from the feeling that every time they faced certain British figures, the war became longer, more expensive, and more dangerous. And when an army starts thinking like that, something has already gone out of control. Now tell me something. Why do you think some British commanders became more of a concern to the Germans than American generals, even with fewer resources and less propaganda? What was behind those cold, calculated, and silent decisions on the battlefield? If this question also intrigued you, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. And comment below, what city are you watching from? I read all the comments and I like to know how far these stories are going. At the beginning of the war, the way the Germans viewed the British was almost comfortable, not in the sense of totally underestimating them, but of believing they already knew the pattern. For the German high command, the British were organized, yes, disciplined, undoubtedly, but excessively cautious. An enemy that retreated when pressured, that preferred to preserve forces rather than risk everything in a single move. This came from the experience of 1940, the fall of France, Dunkirk, the orderly retreats that in German eyes seemed to confirm an old interpretation. The British knew how to lose without collapsing, but they also didn't seem willing to turn the tables on the land battlefield. But this perception began to crack silently. There was no announcement, no clear moment when someone in Berlin slammed their fist on the table and said, "Something has changed." What happened was small, accumulated frustrations, advances that didn't yield the expected collapse, encirclements that didn't close as before, British units that, even under intense pressure, didn't fall apart. They retreated, yes, but they retreated methodically, leaving behind costly terrain, full of tactical traps, well-chosen defensive positions, and above all, wasted time for those advancing. From 1941 onwards, especially after Germany found itself fighting on more than one front, this change began to truly cause concern. The British no longer reacted as before. They didn't launch desperate attacks. They didn't try to respond impulsively. They absorbed the blow, reorganized lines, reinforced supplies, and returned to contact when they knew the cost to the enemy would be high. For an army that had been trained to win quickly, breaking the opponent's morale rapidly, this was corrosive. And what irritated the Germans most was not British brute force, but their coldness. The constant feeling of being watched, measured, studied. Instead of immediate responses, there were long pauses. Instead of predictable counterattacks, there were limited, well-supported, almost surgical actions. It was like fighting someone who refuses to play the game you've prepared. This shock wasn't just military, it was psychological, because Germany had built its confidence on the idea of permanent initiative, to advance, to press, to give the enemy no room to breathe. But against certain British commanders, the advance was beginning to feel like constant wear and tear. Every kilometre cost fuel, men, time. And time, at that point in the war, was no longer a German luxury. Behind the scenes, the language began to change. Reports stopped talking only about conquered positions and started mentioning unexpected resistance, well-maintained lines, and an enemy too cautious to make mistakes. This may seem like a technical detail, but in war, vocabulary says a lot. When one army starts describing the other as difficult to provoke or reluctant to fall into traps, it's a sign that something has gone off script. And perhaps what was most uncomfortable for the Germans was realizing that the British were learning quickly, learning from their own defeats. What in 1940 seemed like weakness in 1941 began to reveal itself as something else: strategic patience, an almost stubborn willingness not to offer the enemy the battle he wanted, in the place and at the time he chose. This was the point at which the war ceased to be merely a clash of forces and became a test of nerves. Because confronting someone who advances shouting is one thing. Confronting someone who waits, observes, and only acts when they are certain you have no way out is something completely different. And it is precisely there that a silent question begins to emerge within the German command, a question that does not appear in public speeches but weighs on every subsequent decision. What else had these British commanders learned while everyone thought they were simply retreating? As this shift began to become clear, something even deeper began to trouble the Germans. The feeling that the British had stopped reacting on instinct. In war, that's enormous. For years, the German army had been trained to provoke quick, almost automatic responses. Press a flank, force a retreat, induce an error, accelerate the pace until the other side broke. It worked in Poland, it worked in France, it worked in the first few months almost everywhere. But against certain British commanders, this mechanism began to fail. The British simply didn't do what was expected of them. When attacked, they didn't panic. When they suffered losses, they didn't try to compensate with hasty attacks. They accepted the discomfort of the moment. They held positions that seemed insignificant. They retreated only a few meters when they could have retreated kilometers. And this created a strange situation for those on the other side. The advance continued, but without that feeling of total control. For the Germans, accustomed to judging the enemy by immediate reactions, this was deeply disconcerting. There was no emotional outburst. There were no clear signs of collapse. Just a cold, almost mechanical routine of defense, reorganization, and waiting. It was like fighting someone who refuses to show weakness, even when under real pressure. This behavior began to generate a specific kind of respect and fear. Because a predictable enemy can be defeated, an impulsive enemy can be manipulated, but a disciplined enemy who follows a method even when everything seems to be falling apart around him is dangerous. He offers no shortcuts. He doesn't deliver easy victories. The Germans began to realize that many British commanders were more concerned with tomorrow than with the present. Every decision seemed designed to last days, weeks, not hours. This clashed directly with the German logic of rapid war. While Germany needed immediate results to sustain multiple fronts simultaneously, the British seemed comfortable prolonging the conflict, even in unfavorable situations. And this affected German morale more than is usually admitted, because war isn't just about maps and numbers, it's about the feeling of progress. When you advance and don't feel like you're breaking the enemy, something starts to gnaw at you from the inside. Officers begin to distrust their own pace. Troops start to wonder why the enemy isn't surrendering, and each extra day of combat increases fatigue, resource consumption, and psychological tension. Another point that stood out was how the British dealt with losses. There were no desperate attempts to recover prestige, no need to retaliate just to save face. They absorbed the blow, adjusted their plan, and moved on. For the Germans, this made everything more difficult because it eliminated the chance of forcing bad decisions through provocation. Gradually, the perception solidified. Certain British commanders were too cold to be pushed into error, and that completely changed the game. Germany might have the initiative, might have the experience, might have excellent units, but it was beginning to face a type of resistance that wouldn't break down, with either speed or sustained pressure. And the more time passed, the more this British discipline seemed not to be a coincidence, but a pattern that began to appear on different fronts, in different units, under different conditions, which raised an uncomfortable question on the German side. If this was a method, who was behind it? Who was shaping this new British way of fighting that sought not to impress, but to wear down? This answer begins to appear when certain names start to appear with increasing frequency in the reports, and that's when the story enters another level. When certain names began to appear repeatedly in German reports, one of them took on a different weight. Not because he was charismatic, nor because he promised quick victories, but precisely for the opposite reason. Bernard Montgomery. It always appeared associated with words that were troubling: delay, excessive preparation, postponed attacks, advancing too slowly. For the German command, this was not a compliment, it was a warning. Montgomery didn't seem interested in impressing anyone. He didn't seek bold moves just to grab headlines. He wouldn't be provoked. When his troops were tired, he waited. When logistics weren't ready, he held back. When the terrain wasn't favorable, he simply didn't advance. For an enemy accustomed to forcing quick decisions, this was almost unbearable, because it took away from Germany what had always worked best: its rhythm. In North Africa, this difference became impossible to ignore. The Germans were used to exploiting mistakes, especially mistakes of haste. But with Montgomery, these mistakes simply didn't happen. He amassed men, fuel, ammunition, and only then did he move. When he moved, he came with everything: coordinated artillery, protected infantry, tanks advancing within a closed plan, leaving no room for improvisation on the other side. The psychological effect of this was enormous. The Germans knew how to fight against swift attacks. They knew how to react to poorly prepared offensives. But they didn't know how to deal with someone who refused to attack until they were sure the cost would be too high for the enemy. Every day of British waiting was a day of German attrition. Supplies dwindled, vehicles broke down, troops grew tired, and the attack that never came began to weigh more heavily than the attack itself. Another point that stood out was the reverse of predictability. Montgomery was predictable in his method, but unpredictable in his timing. The Germans knew he wouldn't attack without a clear advantage, but they were never sure when that advantage would be considered sufficient. This created a constant state of alert. Troops had to be ready at all times, even without direct combat, and that in war is exhausting. There was also something that deeply troubled the German command. Montgomery didn't seem to learn only from victories, but from others' defeats. He studied previous campaigns, analyzed British mistakes, and most importantly, didn't repeat them. What had failed in 1941 simply didn't reappear in 1942. For the Germans, this was a dangerous sign. An enemy who learns quickly drastically reduces their options for maneuver. Meanwhile, many German officers began comparing styles. Not publicly, of course, but behind the scenes. They realized that against Montgomery, there were no shortcuts. There was no classic moment when the enemy exposes himself out of pride, haste, or political pressure. He seemed immune to that kind of mistake. and this turned each confrontation into a battle of attrition that Germany, at that stage of the war, could not sustain for long. As the months passed, Montgomery's name ceased to be merely that of a British commander and came to represent a type of warfare that the Germans detested, slow, expensive, and predictable in its final outcome, but extremely difficult to break along the way. There was no theatrical genius, but there was consistency. And consistency in a prolonged war kills more than audacity. That's why the fear didn't stem from immediate dread, but from the prospect. Facing Montgomery meant knowing that the war wouldn't be resolved quickly, that every mistake would be exploited, and that there would be no room for easy victories. And when an army begins to associate a name with that kind of scenario, it starts to approach every move with more caution, more tension, more attrition. But what's most interesting is that Montgomery was not an isolated case. While the Germans were trying to understand this new British pattern, another theatre of war was beginning to reveal something even more disturbing. There were British commanders applying this same logic in completely different environments with fewer resources and even greater challenges. And when this became clear, German unease ceased to be regional and became systemic. What truly began to weigh on the Germans, more than any specific battle, was realizing that the British had understood something fundamental. War is not won simply by advancing. It is won by keeping the other side tied to a constant struggle. And this depended, above all, on logistics. For a long time, the Germans trusted that speed would compensate for long supply lines. It worked while the campaigns were short. But as the conflict dragged on, this weakness was exposed, and certain British commanders began to exploit precisely this point. The British began to treat the German advance almost as a trap. Every kilometre gained by the Germans meant more fuel consumed, more worn parts, more trucks on the road, more men stuck in the rear. And instead of trying to stop everything at once, the British learned to attack where it hurt less on the map, but more in terms of infrastructure. Secondary roads, depots, support points. Nothing spectacular, nothing cinematic, just constant attrition. This left the Germans in an uncomfortable situation. They could win a battle and still come out losing overall. Tanks stopped due to lack of fuel, units waiting for supplies that never arrived, offensives postponed not for lack of courage, but simply due to practical impossibility. And the worst part, often this happened without the British needing to expose themselves directly. Another important detail is that the British became obsessively protective of their own logistics. There was no more careless improvisation. Escorted convoys, alternate routes, distributed supplies. This made it much more difficult for the Germans to repeat tactics that had worked before. That feeling of "we've seen this movie before" simply disappeared. Every attempt at disruption met with a prepared response. Over time, the Germans began to realize they were being pushed into a type of war they didn't want to fight. A slow war, of continuous consumption, where every mistake was costly and there were no quick victories to boost morale. Moving forward ceased to be a relief and became an overly calculated risk. Standing still was not an option either. It was a double-edged sword. This type of pressure affects decisions at the high command level. Generals begin to discuss not only where to attack, but whether it is worthwhile to attack at all. Field officers begin to hesitate, not out of fear of the enemy ahead, but out of uncertainty about what lies behind. And when the rear becomes a constant source of concern, initiative begins to slip through their fingers. What was most disconcerting for the Germans was that this didn't seem to be the result of isolated genius, but of collective learning. The British were playing a longer game, aware that they didn't need to win every day, only to avoid irreversible defeat. Each week of resistance meant one less week of margin for Germany, and that created a suffocating feeling, because the war ceased to be about grand movements and became about operational survival. It was no longer about how to defeat the enemy, but about how to continue functioning tomorrow. And when an army enters that kind of mentality, something fundamental has already changed. It is at this point that fear begins to take concrete form. Not fear of the British soldier himself, but of the system that was beginning to close in around the German forces, a system that did not seek a quick victory, but an inevitable collapse. And when this becomes clear, German attention turns to another unsettling question. If the British managed to inflict this kind of attrition on familiar fronts, what would happen in even more difficult terrain, where everything seemed to be working against them? It was precisely when the Germans began to see this British pattern as something broader that a new example caught their attention, not because of the size of the forces involved, but because of the almost impossible context in which it was happening. In Asia, far from the major European decision-making centres, William Slim, he commanded British and Commonwealth troops in conditions that many considered hopeless from the outset: dense jungle, extreme heat, constant disease, scarce supplies, and an enemy accustomed to that environment. In theory, it was the perfect scenario for a slow collapse. But it was there that the British showed something that the Germans could not ignore when they analysed the war as a whole. Slim didn't start by winning, and that's important. He started by surviving. Instead of seeking spectacular coups, he focused on something that seemed too simple to be decisive: keeping the army functioning, adequate food, combating disease, guaranteed minimum rest, training adapted to the terrain. None of this made headlines, but it changed everything. Troops that previously melted in the jungle began to resist. Units that retreated in disarray began to move coherently. And little by little, the logic of the confrontation changed. The central point is that Slim understood that discipline wasn't just about obeying orders, but about preserving fighting ability. He didn't force impossible marches. He didn't demand empty heroism. He adjusted the pace to reality. This created a type of trust that was rare in wartime. The soldiers knew they wouldn't be sacrificed for haste or vanity. And soldiers who trust their commanders fight differently. When the Germans analysed campaigns outside of Europe, especially from 1943 onwards, this case began to appear as an indirect reference, not because Germany was fighting there, but because the method was recognisable. It was the same pattern that was beginning to cause concern in North Africa and on other fronts: patience, adaptation, insistence on not repeating mistakes. Slim took a broken army and, without grandiose speeches, transformed it into a force capable of advancing in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. This challenged a deep-seated belief in German military thinking, the idea that certain conditions simply favored one side. Definitively, Slim proved the opposite. He showed that method and learning could neutralize natural disadvantages. And for those who depended on quick and decisive victories, this realization was unsettling. Another detail that stood out was the absence of desperate improvisation. Everything about Slim seemed calculated to last. He accepted setbacks, but organized setbacks. He accepted losses, but never useless ones. Every advance was supported by minimal logistics, adequate intelligence, and clear objectives. Nothing was done to impress distant superiors. It was done to work there, on that ground, in that climate, on that day. Gradually, what seemed like a secondary theatre revealed something bigger. The British weren't just correcting flaws in a specific place. They were developing a culture of command based on continuous adaptation, and this was directly linked to the German fear, the feeling that wherever the British were defeated once, they would return different the next time. When you look at the bigger picture, it's difficult to consider Slim an exception. He was just another piece of a pattern that repeated itself in different environments, against different enemies, with different resources. And this reinforced an uncomfortable idea for those analysing the war from the German side. The problem wasn't facing a specific British commander, but facing a system that was beginning to produce leaders capable of learning faster than the war destroyed them. And that's precisely where the contrast becomes even more evident. Because while this British model was maturing, on another front of the conflict, a different kind of Allied approach was emerging, more direct, more aggressive, more confident. And when the Germans began to compare these styles side by side, an uncomfortable distinction began to form. When the Germans began comparing command styles among the Allies, one difference became difficult to ignore. It wasn't a matter of courage or technical ability, but of behavior under pressure. In various internal reports and analyses, the perception was that many American commanders, especially in the early years of combat in Europe and North Africa, acted more directly, more aggressively, almost always seeking to resolve the situation quickly. This wasn't seen as a weakness, but as something easier to read. The German army was used to dealing with this type of posture. Quick attacks, decisive advances, a constant search for the initiative. It was a familiar game. When a commander feels pressured to show results, he tends to take greater risks, expose flanks, and accelerate movements. And it is at this point that an experienced adversary can anticipate decisions. For the Germans, this pattern was familiar. They knew how to respond. This doesn't mean the Americans were incompetent, far from it. But many were still learning large-scale warfare against a highly experienced enemy. In 1942 and early 1943, there was enormous confidence in material power, industrial capacity, and brute force. And this confidence sometimes translated into haste to advance, haste to attack, haste to prove efficiency. In war, haste almost always leaves its mark. For the Germans, this created a curious feeling. Confronting certain American commanders was dangerous in the short term, but less distressing in the long term. They expected a reaction. They expected a counterattack. They expected an attempt to quickly recover ground. And, more often than not, this expectation was confirmed. This made the battlefield more predictable, even when the fighting was intense. The contrast with the British was becoming increasingly clear. While some Americans sought to impose a rhythm, the British were willing to break it. While some tried to decide the battle at that moment, others considered the impact of the decision weeks later. For the German command, this generated two different types of concern. An enemy that attacks strongly can be contained. An enemy that waits, observes, and chooses the right moment is more difficult to disarm. This contrast frequently appears when observing the figure of George S. Patton. Patton was respected by the Germans. His aggressiveness, speed, and energy did not go unnoticed. But precisely because of that, he was also easier to provoke. He liked to advance. He liked to press. He liked to keep the enemy constantly retreating. This created opportunities, but it also created patterns, and patterns, sooner or later, are exploited. For the Germans, facing Patton was like facing a storm, violent, intense, but with a clear internal logic. Facing certain British commanders was like facing a slow tide, which rises without warning and doesn't recede when you expect it to. One type of threat didn't negate the other, but one of them wore down the mind of those who needed to react more. Another important point is that the British had already been fighting since 1939. They had accumulated defeats, retreats, and costly mistakes. This history made them less anxious to prove anything. The Americans, on the other hand, were entering a conflict that demanded rapid learning under live fire. This created a difference in operational maturity that the Germans clearly perceived. Over time, this difference began to diminish. The Americans learned quickly. They adjusted their methods. They better integrated logistics, intelligence, and command. But by the time these comparisons began to surface, behind the scenes in Germany, the contrast was still evident, and at that stage of the war, any psychological advantage counted. What bothered the Germans most was not the American force itself, but the initial predictability of certain decisions. They knew attacks were coming. They knew there would be constant pressure. The bigger problem was on the other side, with commanders who gave no clear signals of their next move, who did not react as expected, who did not allow themselves to be pushed into bad decisions. And it is precisely this combination, more patient British and increasingly strong Americans, that begins to create an even more worrying scenario, because, little by little, the predictable enemy was beginning to learn from the unpredictable, and when these styles began to converge, the German margin for error became dangerously narrow. As time went on, what really began to weigh on the Germans was realizing that they weren't dealing merely with cautious commanders, but with commanders who learned systematically. Mistakes didn't disappear on the British side. That would be unrealistic. But the difference lay in what came after the mistake. Where there had previously been repetition, now there was correction. Where a failure had dragged on for months, now it was dissected, adjusted, and transformed into a basis for the next decision. For the Germans, this was deeply unsettling, because German warfare relied heavily on the idea that the enemy would break before it, could fully reorganize. The constant pressure, the speed, the initial shock served precisely to prevent this learning process. But against the British, this wasn't working as before. They were getting hit, retreating, absorbing the impact, and coming back different. What's most irritating is that this evolution wasn't accompanied by exaggerated propaganda or triumphalist speeches. Often it wasn't even immediately apparent. It was perceived in the details. A better chosen position, better synchronized artillery, infantry that already knew what to expect. Small changes that, added together, made each new confrontation more costly than the last. The Germans began to notice that old tricks were no longer working. Maneuvers that had yielded good results in previous campaigns were now encountering prepared resistance. Flanks that were once vulnerable appeared protected. Rapid advances were hitting deeper defenses. It wasn't that the British had become unbeatable, far from it, but they were becoming less exploitable, and that, in war, is a dangerous transformation. Another crucial point was operational humility. Certain British commanders didn't cling to failed plans out of pride. If something didn't work, it was abandoned. There was no blind insistence just to prove the original idea was right. For the Germans, accustomed to an increasingly rigid command culture as the war progressed, this created an uncomfortable contrast. A flexible enemy survives longer. This constant learning also affected German morale, because fighting against someone who improves with each encounter generates enormous psychological wear and tear. You enter the battle knowing that the mistake that worked last time probably won't work again. This forces you to invent, to take risks, to expend more mental energy on each decision. And, under continuous pressure, this burden weighs heavily. Furthermore, the British demonstrated a rare ability to wait for the right moment. There was no rush to retaliate. If a defeat occurred, it didn't need to be answered immediately. The focus was on preventing the mistake from escalating. For the Germans, this negated one of their most effective weapons, provocation. There was no impulsive reaction to exploit. There was no hasty revenge to ambush. Over time, the feeling among the German command was that every victory against the British came with a hidden price. You gained ground, but you gave away information. You revealed methods. You displayed patterns. And the British watched everything. Next time, they would show up prepared. This transformed every German tactical success into a strategic risk. This continuous learning process also did something even more dangerous. It leveled the playing field in the war. It stripped Germany of the psychological advantage of the experience accumulated since 1939. Little by little, the enemy, who had previously always seemed a step behind, began to walk side by side with them. And when that happens, Those who depend on quick victories begin to lose their footing. Ultimately, German fear wasn't linked to a specific blow, but to the trend, to the curve, to the feeling that time was no longer on their side when facing certain British commanders, because each unresolved battle quickly became a lesson learned by the other side. And when the enemy learns faster than you can defeat them, war ceases to be a contest of strength and becomes a race against time. And it is precisely at this point that everything comes together. Because when the German command begins to understand that it is not facing just men or units, but a system that absorbs errors, adapts, and returns stronger, the question ceases to be how to defeat them, and becomes another, much more unsettling one. How much time is left before this British way of fighting makes German victory impossible? When all these pieces began to fall into place, German fear ceased to be vague and became a cold calculation. It was no longer a matter of isolated battles, nor of specific commanders seen as exceptions. What lay before them was a clear pattern. Certain British leaders transformed any campaign into something long, expensive, and mentally exhausting. And, for a Germany pressed on multiple fronts, this was the worst possible scenario. The Germans didn't need to lose a battle to feel this effect. Simply not winning quickly was enough. Each extra week meant wasted fuel, worn-out parts, exhausted troops, and increasingly, difficult decisions for the high command. The war ceased to be a sequence of advances and became a sum of accumulated problems. And the most uncomfortable thing was that the British seemed perfectly comfortable with it. There was no panic on the British side when things didn't go as planned. There was no need to prove immediate superiority. The focus was on resisting, adjusting, and continuing. This took away the German sense of control, that impression that all it took was a little more. Pressure for everything to fall apart. With certain British commanders, nothing fell apart. Everything creaked. Everything was difficult. Everything was delayed. This forced respect didn't come from speeches or propaganda, but from direct experience. When an army begins to associate an adversary with the idea of inevitable attrition, it changes its way of thinking. Every offensive is then debated twice. Every advance carries a hidden doubt. And in war, constant doubt corrodes initiative. Therefore, the German fear regarding certain British commanders was not fear in an emotional sense. It was something more dangerous. The certainty that confronting this type of leadership meant entering a war that Germany could no longer sustain for long. A war without shortcuts, without quick collapses, without repeated mistakes on the other side. Ultimately, the British didn't need to be the fastest, nor the most aggressive, nor the loudest. They became something more troublesome, persistent, impatient, and increasingly difficult to deceive. And when an enemy reaches that point, the balance of war begins to shift, even before major defeats appear on the maps. Perhaps that is why, looking back, the most honest question is not why the Germans feared certain British commanders, but at what point they realized they were trapped in a type of war from which they could not escape. Because this understanding does not arise from a single confrontation. It is born slowly, battle after battle, decision after decision, until the day when advancing no longer seems like victory and waiting for the next British move becomes in itself a burden too heavy to bear. What did you think of this story? At what point did it become clear to you that the war against certain British commanders was no longer just a matter of force, but of time, attrition, and patience? I'd love to read your opinion, so leave a comment below. If this story captivated you until the end, leave a like with subscribe to the channel and join us to continue discovering real, intense, and rarely told stories like this one. Stories that show that, in war, victory doesn't always go to those who advance fastest, but to those who know how to wait.